when authorities in the Netherlands took unprecedented action against a semiconductor manufacturer operating on their soil, they triggered a chain reaction that would expose the fragility of the entire global technology ecosystem. This wasn't simply another corporate takeover, it was a declaration, one that revealed how desperately nations are scrambling to control the building blocks of modern civilization. The company at the center? Nexperia? The real story? Far more complex than anyone anticipated. What we're witnessing today goes far beyond the original disputes over microchip manufacturing. The confrontation that began with silicon wafers and circuit boards has metastasized into a comprehensive struggle touching every critical sector of the global economy, from the obscure minerals buried deep underground to the petroleum that powers nations and even the financial systems that bind the world together. In the corridors of power across Washington and throughout the European Union's Brussels headquarters, policymakers insist their actions stem from legitimate security concerns. They frame their decisions as defensive measures, necessary steps to safeguard their technological sovereignty and protect their citizens. But if you're observing this situation from Beijing, the narrative looks entirely different. To Chinese officials and analysts, this appears less like protection and more like suppression. A coordinated campaign designed specifically to prevent their nation from achieving technological parity with the West. The Dutch government's extraordinary decision to forcibly seize control of Nexperia sent shockwaves through international markets and diplomatic channels alike. The message couldn't have been clearer. Western nations are prepared to resurrect strategies from the Cold War era, employing state power to directly intervene in corporate ownership when geopolitical interests are at stake. This single action accomplished something profound. It didn't merely impact one semiconductor company's operations. It fundamentally destabilized the delicate equilibrium that had kept global supply networks functioning. For decades, these supply chains operated on assumptions of open markets and predictable trade relationships. Those assumptions have now been shattered. But here's what makes this moment particularly significant. China hasn't been caught unprepared. For years, long before Western sanctions became commonplace, Beijing has been methodically constructing an alternative infrastructure. They've invested hundreds of billions into domestic semiconductor fabrication facilities, recruited thousands of engineers to design proprietary chip architectures, and secured long-term access to the raw materials that every advanced economy desperately needs. Now that patient preparation is beginning to yield results. While Western restrictions have certainly created obstacles and delays, they've simultaneously catalyzed something potentially more dangerous for the West. They've transformed China into an increasingly self-sufficient technological power that no longer depends on foreign goodwill. As European governments continue tightening their grip on technology transfer, a new vulnerability has emerged in plain sight. It involves rare earth elements, those little-known metals with exotic names that most people have never heard of, yet which exist inside virtually every electronic device, every precision machine, every piece of advanced military hardware. And in this particular domain, China doesn't just participate in the market. It dominates it so thoroughly that any decision Beijing makes about export policy can send tremors through industries across the entire Western world. For more than a decade, while Western analysts dismissed it as unrealistic, China has been pursuing an audacious objective, constructing a completely independent semiconductor ecosystem that relies on no foreign inputs whatsoever. From an outside perspective, this seemed like an impossible dream. The semiconductor industry represents perhaps the most complex manufacturing achievement in human history, involving thousands of specialized components, requiring expertise across dozens of scientific disciplines, and depending on supply chains that span the globe. Yet behind the scenes, an enormous mobilization has been taking place across China. The government has coordinated efforts across every link in the semiconductor production chain, from the initial stages of chip architecture and design through the incredibly complex fabrication processes, all the way to the sophisticated lithography equipment needed to etch circuits measured in billionths of a meter, and finally through to testing and packaging. Beijing's objective is elegantly simple, even if achieving it is extraordinarily difficult. Never again will China find itself at the mercy of foreign suppliers for technology that determines national competitiveness. This strategic push didn't suddenly emerge as a reaction to recent trade tensions. Its origins trace back to 2014, when China established the National Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund. This wasn't a modest pilot program. It eventually grew to command more than $70 billion in capital, deployed specifically to finance local chip manufacturers and provide attractive packages to lure talented engineers away from Taiwan, Japan, and the United States. The government set an ambitious target. By 2025, China should be producing 70% of all the semiconductors it consumes domestically. While progress has lagged somewhat behind the original timeline, the gap is narrower than most Western observers expected. Consider SMIC, the Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, which stands as China's largest and most advanced chip producer. Recently, this company achieved something that sent shockwaves through policy circles in Washington. They successfully manufactured 7-nanometer processors using exclusively Chinese-made equipment. This represents a technological milestone that many experts had predicted would remain out of reach for years. Or look at Huawei, the telecommunications giant that found itself cut off from American chip suppliers and placed on various blacklists. Despite these restrictions, or perhaps because of them, Huawei's newest smartphone models now operate on processors designed and manufactured entirely within China. When these devices appeared on the market, they represented not just products, but proof of concept. Proof that China could navigate around the most stringent technology barriers the West could construct. What enables these breakthroughs? Behind each success lies an extensive infrastructure of state-funded research laboratories, elite universities churning out engineering graduates, and private companies operating with significant government support, all coordinated under a unified national strategy that treats semiconductor independence as a matter of survival. The economics work in China's favor in ways that Western competitors find difficult to match. Labor costs remain substantially lower. Government incentives cover enormous portions of startup and operational expenses, and the raw materials needed for chip production are often sourced domestically or from nearby partners. Even operating under the weight of international sanctions, China has managed to transform these restrictions from obstacles into motivation. When you examine the trade data, the pattern becomes clear. Imports of American semiconductors fell dramatically throughout 2024. Yet during that same period, domestic Chinese chip production surged by more than 40%. Meanwhile, American and European companies find themselves struggling with economics that don't make sense. New semiconductor fabrication plants, called fabs in industry terminology, being constructed in Arizona and Germany, carry price tags approaching $30 billion each. These facilities take years to build, require thousands of specialized workers, and operate on margins that would make traditional manufacturing executives uncomfortable. China's approach succeeds through scale and coordination. Their factories cost a fraction as much to construct, and government subsidies cover nearly every input, from electricity to equipment purchases to workforce training. The message Beijing is sending to the global industry couldn't be more explicit. For every door the West closes, China will construct 10 new ones. This determination is precisely what now keeps policymakers in Washington and allied capitals awake at night. The Biden administration has expanded and extended the export restrictions that were first introduced during the Trump presidency, explicitly prohibiting companies like ASML, Tokyo Electron, and Applied Materials from supplying their most advanced tools to Chinese semiconductor facilities. But here's the paradox that Western strategists failed to anticipate. Every new restriction, every additional barrier, only intensifies Beijing's determination to achieve complete independence. With each blocked shipment, with each denied export license, Chinese firms and researchers are learning to reverse engineer, replicate, and ultimately improve upon the technologies they once simply imported. The West assumed that denying China access to advanced equipment would stop their progress. Instead, it may have accelerated their innovation. And now, as the full scope of China's semiconductor program becomes visible to Western intelligence agencies and industry analysts, something close to panic is spreading through European capitals. The United States might have established the initial battle lines in this technology conflict, but it was the Netherlands, a small European nation better known for tulips than geopolitics, that executed the most provocative maneuver to date. The Dutch government's decision to forcibly seize control of Nexperia, a major semiconductor manufacturer owned by Chinese interests, stunned both financial markets and diplomatic observers around the world. To justify this extraordinary intervention, Dutch authorities invoked an emergency statute dating back to the Cold War era, citing these vague governance concerns and claiming the company's operations posed unspecified risks to national security. Few serious analysts accept this explanation at face value. The reality behind closed doors is considerably more straightforward. This was about American pressure. For many months, officials from Washington had been privately, and sometimes publicly, warning their European counterparts about the dangers of allowing Chinese-controlled firms to operate advanced manufacturing facilities inside European Union territory. The argument was always framed in terms of technology transfer, intellectual property theft, and strategic vulnerability. This time, facing pressure from their most important military ally, the government in The Hague complied with American wishes. Nexperia is far from a minor player in the global semiconductor ecosystem. Headquartered in the Dutch city of Nijmegen, the company manufactures more than 11 billion individual chips annually. These components flow to automobile manufacturers, smartphone producers, and industrial equipment makers distributed across the planet. Here's where the situation becomes complex. Approximately 80% of Nexperia's manufactured components are shipped to China for the critical steps of packaging and testing before being returned to Western markets for final integration into consumer and industrial products. Severing this flow would certainly disrupt Beijing's supply chain infrastructure, but it would simultaneously create chaos for European industries that have grown dependent on this steady supply of affordable, reliable semiconductor components. The real motivation driving this seizure wasn't about corporate governance standards. It was about strategic control of a critical technology node. By taking over Nexperia, European Union authorities gained something invaluable: the ability to monitor not just what the facility produces, but also its intellectual property, its production methodologies, and its client relationships. European officials, speaking on condition of anonymity, have acknowledged that one primary objective is preventing Chinese engineers from accessing sensitive production data that could potentially assist competing firms back in mainland China. In essence, this represents Europe's version of technological containment, an attempt to create barriers around knowledge and capability rather than just products. But this strategy carries enormous risks, and the potential for retaliation is substantial. China represents Europe's single largest trading partner, with bilateral commerce exceeding €850 billion in 2024 alone. These aren't trivial economic ties that can be easily severed or replaced. If Beijing chooses to respond with corresponding measures, the Netherlands could find itself facing export restrictions on materials critical to its own high-tech industries. Even more concerning, Dutch companies like ASML, which holds a monopoly on extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, the most advanced chip-making equipment in existence, could suddenly find themselves targeted in response. Without consistent access to rare earth elements such as neodymium and dysprosium, ASML's precision motors and optical systems would cease to function. There are no alternative suppliers at scale, and no substitute materials that can replicate their unique magnetic and optical properties. European leaders find themselves trapped in an excruciating dilemma. They want to maintain alignment with American security policy and preserve the transatlantic alliance. Yet simultaneously, they remain deeply dependent on Chinese markets for exports and Chinese sources for critical raw materials. The seizure of Nexperia might appear successful when viewed through a narrow lens, but it simultaneously exposes just how illusory Europe's technological independence truly is. And as Beijing's leadership evaluates possible responses to this provocation, the balance of power in the semiconductor industry is shifting once again, this time toward the resources that no Western factory can operate without, regardless of how advanced their engineering might be. So, China's overwhelming dominance in the rare earth elements industry has evolved into one of the most potent economic weapons available in this global standoff. While media attention focuses primarily on semiconductor chips and tariff policies, the genuine pressure point exists underground, in the specialized minerals that make every advanced technology possible, from smartphones to missile systems. China currently controls approximately 70% of global rare earth mining operations and commands more than 90% of the world's refining capacity. These elements aren't optional components. They're absolutely essential for manufacturing everything from electric vehicle motors to wind turbine generators to the guidance systems in modern military hardware. Without steady access to these materials, the West's green energy transition and defense industries would simply grind to a halt. Europe and the United States have been attempting to diversify their rare earth supply chains for years, but progress has been frustratingly slow and incomplete. Throughout 2024, the European Union imported 100% of its heavy rare earth requirements, and more than 85% of its light rare earth needs directly from Chinese sources. The only significant non-Chinese supplier, Lynas Corporation in Australia, produces merely a small fraction of global demand and lacks the refining capacity to process materials to the purity levels required for advanced applications. Meanwhile, Beijing has begun implementing tighter export controls once again. New regulations now require special government-issued licenses, even if a product contains just 0.1% Chinese rare earth content, effectively giving authorities absolute control over who receives access to these critical materials. For companies like ASML or Siemens, this represents an existential threat. Their high-precision machinery depends absolutely on metals such as neodymium, praseodymium, and dysprosium, materials that are extraordinarily difficult to substitute and even more challenging to refine outside of China's established infrastructure. ASML has publicly stated that it maintains stockpiles of critical rare earth materials, but these reserves cannot last indefinitely. Each future shipment will become more expensive, take longer to arrive, and remain subject to political approval from Beijing. The West has responded by announcing new mining projects across Canada, Greenland, and the United States. Yet refining remains the insurmountable bottleneck. Constructing a rare earth processing facility in Europe can require up to 7 years, largely because of stringent environmental regulations and organized local opposition to industrial facilities. Beijing understands this vulnerability perfectly and is leveraging it with increasing confidence. Each new export restriction serves as a reminder to Western leaders that genuine industrial strength begins with control over raw materials, not with diplomatic rhetoric or policy speeches. This dynamic is clearly visible in how observers view the situation. In a recent poll I conducted within our community, I asked what would happen if China truly implemented a complete cutoff of rare earth exports to the West. Out of more than 200 participants, 86% indicated their belief that the United States economy would be forced to capitulate first. Only 6% thought China's trade position would suffer the greater damage. That overwhelming response reveals everything about how fragile Washington's industrial foundation has become and how much economic leverage Beijing currently possesses. As rare earth supplies continue tightening and export controls multiply, the pressure is cascading through global supply networks. Washington recognizes its vulnerability, and now it's racing desperately to secure an alternative lifeline in a completely different region, searching for the next critical resource that could offset Chinese dominance. The United States Treasury's $20 billion financial package for Argentina has become one of the most contentious economic decisions of the year. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent characterized it as an economic lifeline for a struggling nation, but few informed observers believe this was genuinely about stabilizing the Argentine peso. Behind the diplomatic language and official statements, this was a geopolitical wager, a desperate race to prevent China from consolidating its control over South America's lithium deposits. Argentina occupies a strategic position at the heart of what's known as the Lithium Triangle, alongside Chile and Bolivia. This region contains more than 70% of the world's confirmed lithium reserves. As global demand for electric vehicles and battery storage systems continues accelerating, these salt flats have effectively become the oil fields of the 21st century. China already dominates the lithium refining process and has invested tens of billions of dollars through state-backed companies like Ganfeng Lithium and CATL, securing long-term extraction rights to Argentina's most productive deposits. Washington fears losing influence across the entire region, a concern that drove Bessent's controversial bailout package. The strategy was to purchase loyalty, providing the struggling government of President Javier Milei with enough dollars to stabilize Argentina's collapsing currency and create breathing room for economic reforms. Yet the peso continued falling regardless, declining another 2% within days of the deal's announcement. Inflation remains above 130% annually. Foreign currency reserves are nearly depleted, and Argentina remains trapped in an endless cycle of debt to the International Monetary Fund. Even ordinary Argentines are rushing to convert their pesos into dollars, clearly betting that this latest rescue package won't succeed where so many previous attempts have failed. From a financial perspective, the U.S. Treasury is hemorrhaging cash into what increasingly looks like a bottomless pit. From a political perspective, Beijing's influence across South America continues expanding regardless. Chinese firms are still growing their lithium operations throughout the region, offering more attractive terms and faster financing than Washington can match. What was intended as a demonstration of American strength now appears more like an act of desperation, pouring billions into a market that cannot be saved through cash injections alone. And as American funds disappear into Argentina's inflationary spiral, a new challenge is already emerging closer to home, one that directly threatens America's own energy sector and demonstrates how rapidly China is redrawing the global map of commerce. China's most recent strategic moves have opened an entirely new front in this expanding trade conflict, this time across the world's oceans. As tensions continue escalating over semiconductors and rare earth elements, Beijing has quietly begun restructuring global energy flows in ways that directly undermine American economic interests. Over just a few months, China has redirected billions of dollars worth of oil purchases away from the United States and toward Canada. Currently, more than 70% of crude petroleum leaving British Columbia's export terminals is bound for Chinese refineries, while shipments from American ports continue shrinking month after month. In October alone, China purchased approximately 5 million barrels of Canadian crude, representing a sharp increase from the previous year's levels. This pivot isn't happening by accident or market forces alone. Washington's tariffs and unpredictable sanctions have made American exports unreliable from a buyer's perspective, while Canada offers a steady alternative at discounts ranging from 5 to 15% below American prices. For Beijing, this shift makes perfect sense. It's cheaper, politically safer, and strategically smarter. For the United States, it represents another painful economic loss. The energy sector, which politicians regularly celebrate as a symbol of American independence and strength, now finds itself caught in the crossfire of geopolitical competition. But China hasn't stopped with simply redirecting purchases. Beijing has also begun implementing targeted measures against American-flagged vessels, imposing new port levies on ships arriving at Chinese harbors. Each vessel docking at a Chinese port must now pay substantial administrative fees that can reach several $1 million per trip, depending on cargo volume and vessel size. The policy sounds technical and bureaucratic, but its economic impact is substantial. Shipping costs for American crude oil destined for Asian markets have jumped 15% in just 1 week, making American petroleum far less competitive compared to alternatives from Canada, Russia, or the Middle East.